Welcome everyone to our B2 program workshop. My name is Michelle and I'm going to be walking you through an example of a B2 lesson 1 for mid and low. So this level here that I'm going to be showing you is Terra. So kind of right in the middle of our mid-low, and we're going to walk through the SMART textbook lesson 1 together and talk about some of the important parts of the syllabus. Okay, so let's get started looking at the 3 different sections in your lesson 1. We'll start in the lesson with ESL vocab. So this component in your syllabus is recommended to take around 10 minutes. Novel workshop is the second component, and the novel workshop will span usually an hour and 10 to an hour and 15 of your class time. And the final component will be the test prep section. This section is the largest and should take around an hour and a half to compromise your full 3-hour class. So those are the 3 different components, and we'll start off looking at ESL vocab. The first section is called collocation matching. So the sections are all very aptly named. Here the students have to do a matching activity where they'll see an English collocation. These collocations are based off of middle school and high school level vocabulary, depending on what level the students are in, that they'll need to try to memorize. And so we have the English collocation here and the Korean matching collocations. So the students will click on the different collocations to match them together. Okay, so something to be aware of is if a student clicks on the English collocation and accidentally, or they're not sure about the word, they press the incorrect Korean collocation, there will be a little time ding. Okay, so that means the students have to pause for a moment, they can't press anything on their tab, and after about a 3-second penalty, they can keep going with this activity. So this matching activity is timed. Here on my teacher tab, we don't see any kind of timed component pop up because I'm not in a real classroom. But for you guys as instructors, you'll be in a real classroom, and when you open up this section, it will be a timed test section, similar to the timed components in like an A2 high, or if you've taught maybe an F1 program, these sections are timed. So the students have to match the different collocations, and after they're finished, you will facilitate a class review altogether. During that review, I really strongly encourage that you prepare media in order to help the students better understand the different collocations. And you can also play the different collocations out loud. So for example,
eating a balanced diet.
You can play it so the students can listen to the collocation and then have the class repeat and ask leading questions to make sure the students are understanding all those different words. So that's our first section, the matching. You can see it's here in purple. So when you see those purple sections, that's going to mean it's a timed battle mode. That's what the syllabus refers to it as, a timed battle mode activity that the students will have to complete, and their time usually converts to a letter grade that automatically gets uploaded to the MERP. So collocation matching leads us then to the next section, which is going to be the map completion. So these maps are based off of a logical hierarchy or a logical structure on how the different terms can be connected together. So here the students have to select out of the 3 terms which one will be like their topic, and these 3 which ones will be the main ideas that connect to the topic. Okay, so something to keep in mind while you're prepping for this section is to make sure that as the instructor, you really understand what is the connection of this map, how is it going to be connected, and in your syllabus for the class, you'll be able to see it walks you through the different types or ways that these maps are connected together. So perhaps it's expository, like the map we're looking at in lesson 1, which means that we have the topic and the details or main ideas that relate. Another example is the second type. This expository section does our topic, major details with minor details. And finally in your syllabus, you'll see the type number 3, which is a narrative map. So this means that the students are trying to look for what the best suited title for that map would be, and how the story would go in chronological order with the different events and situations. Okay, so just be mindful while you're preparing for the class that you as the instructor really understand how this map is logically connected. And that's going to really help you out so that if the students give a incorrect answer, if we put the light bulb on here, we can see that our topic is healthy habits, and the details or ideas that relate are examples of different healthy habits that you should keep. The incorrect answer that's still left over here in the other tile, studying late at night, you want to make sure you can have a discussion with your students so that they logically understand why studying late at night is not related with the different topic in detail here. So just keep that in your mind as you're preparing. So you can use different functions on your tab 2 here as you go through the activities. You can use the top back arrow that's on your sidebar, or if you use the gray arrows at the bottom, it'll allow you to move through the pages. And if you're finished with that component, once we finish map completion, it'll ask you if you'd like to move to the next component. You can simply press yes, and it will just load the data for the next page that follows in your Smart textbook. So those 2 pages that I just demoed for you guys are the ESL vocab components. And so that should take about roughly 10 minutes in your class, and that's the first section. We are in now to the novel workshop, the second component of the class, and we start off with some more vocabulary. Okay, so in B2, one of the main objectives of the course is to have the students memorize and practice relevant vocabulary that they'll see, as I mentioned, in middle school or high school level. Okay, so we have another timed component. It was in purple on our guide, so this is going to be timed once again, and it means that the students, again, will have to match these collocations together, and once the activity finishes, and you end the test, it will bring you to a screen that looks like this. So you'll be able to see the top 3 students in the class. They'll earn a gold, silver, or bronze medal based off of their time, how fast they were able to complete the activity. And you can upload those scores right to the MERP, and it will convert to a letter grade that will be part of their CE evaluation. On the student tab, they will see, for example, round 2 during the section, what their result was. So they can see their different times for the different timed components and keep track of it themselves as well. Now, one tip I can offer you guys for this B2 class is, as the medals are awarded, you'll find that maybe often the gold and the silver ends up going to the same students. Some of our students are really brilliant with their vocabulary, they study vocab all the time, and it means they're going to often be earning the gold and silver, right? Now that can kind of create a competitive or perhaps sometimes a negative energy in the classroom. Maybe some students get really disappointed that they can never get gold or silver or bronze, and they don't get to see their name up here on the screen. And especially in a lower level, maybe you're doing B2 Mega, some of the students can be a little bit sensitive. So what I recommend for you guys to do is during these timed race components is you could try having your students race against themselves. So what I like to do sometimes in my class is draw my seating plan up on the board and then call the different students' scores and put it up on the board so that when we do the first vocab matching compared to the second vocab matching, I encourage my students to beat their own score rather than necessarily trying to beat each other and getting really competitive and a little bit salty when they don't get the gold medal. So you can obviously adjust, depending on what your student group is like, but it's just a tip for you to keep in mind if these battle mode time components start to get too competitive in your class or you'd like to switch it up. Try encouraging your students to race against themselves, to even keep track of their times in a paper notebook and week by week see if they're improving. That can be a really nice way to maybe modify the competitive attitude in the classroom. Okay, so with the vocabulary section, you'll see perhaps there are 2 pages. It depends on the lesson and the level. Sometimes there's only 1, but sometimes there's 2. So in order for the students to be able to go to the next page, they have to match all the vocabulary on page 1 and then use their arrows on their tab to move to the next page and complete that vocabulary as well. So you should be reminding your students once they finish page 1, press the arrow because the timer's going, right? So just remind them to press the arrow just in case there is a second page so they can move on and complete the rest of the vocabulary. And as there is a lot of different vocabulary here, a lot of kind of idioms and a lot of colloquial type language as well, I strongly encourage that you prep relevant media or come up with explanations ahead of your time in the classroom as part of your prep. That way you're going to really be able to explain to your students some of the trickier vocab that will appear later in the reading section. Right, so now that we've finished our vocabulary matching and preview, it brings us right into the reading. Okay, and with this reading, this is a novel reading and comprehension section. The vocab words we saw previously are now going to appear in the passage. So as the students are reading, they can be making note of that important vocabulary. Here for this section, it is a timed component as well, and it is a summary activity. So what's going to happen is a timer will appear, you'll start the test, and the students will have time to skim and scan through the passage in order to find the 2 missing collocations and fill in the blanks at the bottom. So down here, this is like a story summary of what they read in the passage. So the words that appear here, sometimes they are directly stated in the passage, and other times they have to be changed slightly. Maybe the tense of the verb has to be changed, or maybe it's actually like a paraphrasing type activity depending on the level. They might have to put a new word that makes logical sense in the section. When the students are completing this timed section, if they answer the word correctly in the blank, it will appear in blue. And if the word is incorrect, they'll have a little ding, a little noise that lets them know it's incorrect, and it will be in red. So in this case, this is a spelling mistake. They are missing the vowels A and E in the word parents, which, during a timed fast activity is a common error that students run into. So it'll appear in red until they get the correct answer, and then it turns to blue and the activity finishes for the students. So after they complete this summary, again, you'll have to upload your scores to the MERP and hit the review function. Once you start to review, what you'll want to do for the reading passage is walk the students through the passage, either by having them listen. If you press your play button here, the passage will play for you and the students can listen and read along. Something I like to do as well in my class is give my students opportunities to read out loud, right? This is a really great chance for them to speak in perfect English because they're reading the story and therefore reading the great sentences and model here. So I'll cold call different students and have them read the story out loud. And I like to go maybe paragraph by paragraph, or if they're maybe in a little bit of a higher level, maybe I'm in a bridge class, I could do a few paragraphs or the whole story all at once out loud, and then I'll make sure to ask leading questions that I've prepared to my students to make sure they understand like the plot in the story, the characters in the story, the different events. And I also want to make a point of using those previous vocab words in my leading questions or as an answer to one of my leading questions to really make sure that the students understand those collocations they were just before practicing in vocabulary. So as I prep this section, I like to make sure that I look, for example, one of the collocations was swiftly and fiercely in our vocab matching section previously. So when I'm talking about this paragraph with the students, I'll want to ask leading or confirmation questions about that collocation to make sure they really understand. Okay, so if we move through the reading, we had our part 1. Part 2 is going to be the same thing, a summary activity, read the story together and ask your leading questions about it. And then you can move on to the next component. So all in, the reading should take somewhere in the classroom from 15 minutes, I believe is what the syllabus recommends, up to about 20 minutes with your students. After the reading section, we're now at our writing timed section, and this section is your sentence structure practice. Okay, so the activity and objective here is for the students to understand the logical connection in the parts of a sentence and how to put it all together. So there are different collocations in the overhead box, and the students should click on the words in order to build the sentences below. Again, this is a timed component, so they'll be trying to press as fast as they can. And if they click on the wrong collocation, again, they'll have a slight time penalty and a little bit of a ding, letting them know it's the wrong answer. So as they complete the different sentences, their page will close and they'll get a score. And when you review with your class, what you should be doing is asking leading questions to the students in order to help them understand the connection of the sentence and why the words go in that particular order. So here in my classroom, I like to, depending on the level, start to talk about parts of a sentence in terms of nouns, verbs, adjectives, these kinds of things, pronouns. In maybe a B2 mega, I might use like a who, a where, a when, a why, those kinds of WH words to help them understand how the sentence is put together, and I'll cold call my students in order to get those answers from the class. Okay, so this writing section here for sentence structure practice could take about 10 minutes of your novel workshop. And now that they've tried to internalize some of that structure, here we have a sentence variation activity. So they've internalized some of the structure from our previous writing exercise, and in this second writing exercise, we're now going to have the students use variation and different examples to see if they're able to build the sentences themselves using their own ideas. So there's always a model, which I like to go over with the class together, have a student read out loud and break it down. And then there are blanks that the students need to fill in. I recommend always doing number one together as a class. So you can cold call different students and put together a sentence. So our model here, cleaning erasers was the perfect classroom chore for Roger. Here maybe we need a different action word or verb, so we can say maybe washing dishes was the perfect job for Michelle teacher. And I'll cold call my students or even give my own example to help them understand what they're looking for in the different blanks. And then I can put time on the clock, put up a timer, or let my students know that I'm going to give them about 5 minutes to complete the rest of the writing exercise on their own. Once the students finish with all of their sentences, you're going to want to make sure that you cold call or do your little random wheel and pick a few students to share their sentences. And students that did maybe like a particularly great job, you want to discuss their sentences with the class and make sure that we can have a peer-to-peer moment where a student who had a really logical and complete answer is able to justify for the other students in the classroom. And it's a great moment for you to be able to praise your students, send them badges, give them stickers, and really praise their hard work during sentence variation here. Okay, so this writing practice activity has 2 pages here with a bunch of different sentences. Something I've tried in the classroom before too, depending on the level, is to have students work together with a desk friend or divide the different sentences between groups of students and have them share with each other just for your time's sake. This activity starting out, particularly when we're talking about like B2 low. The students end up taking a really long time to make these sentences, and we only have about 15 minutes to complete everything. So you could always have them work together with a desk friend, or maybe divide the questions between your class. That way you are completing all the work, but you can do so in a more timely manner. Just a tip for you guys. There are the 2 pages here, and after the writing exercise, it brings us to the speaking. Okay, now the speaking is a group activity. So here, what you'll want to do is to put your students into groups. And once they're in their groups or with their partners, they're going to have to create a script together. Now, if you were to simply just put the students in pairs and tell them, okay, go, make your speaking script, you might end up with a lot of really strange, nonsensical scripts. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you walk through the different sentences. Here we have 6 different sentences the students will need to complete. Help them to understand what kind of words, what category or type of word belongs in the blank. So they do have some flexibility on how they're going to complete the sentences, but in certain cases, there's only like a certain type of word that can belong. So here we have blank was surprised to see. We know that we're going to need a who. A person that belongs in this blank. There's really no other logical word that can belong. But here for our first one, blank was the perfect. You know, maybe there's more room to be creative and have the students change it a little bit. However, this structure is mirroring structure that we've seen first in the reading and structure that the students have then practiced during the 2 different writing exercises. So hopefully by the time they're speaking now, this structure could be a little bit more familiar, and they're going to be able to logically create their own sentences and complete the script. So after the students finish their script, you're going to have them present to the class. Now, what I like to do for the speaking section is make sure that my students stand up. Now, it doesn't have to be at the front of the classroom. If I have a smaller group of students, I do like to call them up to the front because they always need more practice speaking in front of the group. But if I have a larger class, I will just have them stand up at their desk, okay? And the reason that I like to do that is because it creates a little bit more of a formal atmosphere around their speaking, and they feel more motivated to do a better job while they're presenting their script together. And while the students are presenting their story to the class, let's say June and Jack, they're speaking together, the rest of the students in my class, they need to evaluate the group presentations. So in your first lessons, like this Terra Lesson 1, you should go over what this criteria means and what it looks like. So there are 3 different evaluation criteria. The presenter was confident, they were clear, and the presentation was interesting. Just make sure your students understand what these different criteria mean. And they'll have to give a score accordingly as they sit and listen to the presentation. They'll be marking on their tab what score they give to each group. Okay? Here, in your syllabus, it does let you know that you should be inputting the scores into the MERP. Now you can also definitely talk to your branch manager or whoever, maybe your team manager or head instructor, and see what your school's policy is like for that one. But in your syllabus, it does let you know that part of the methodology is to then input the scores into the MERP as part of the class evaluation. So just keep that in mind. I also like to take this presentation chance as a way to have a really good discussion with my class about what goes into a good presentation. I like to go over things like eye contact, body language, tone of voice, emotion and tone, and those kinds of things as well. And really have a nice group discussion on, for today, who is the best group, and maybe for today, what can the other groups improve on. And I like to keep track of that feedback feedback in their paper notebooks. I encourage my students to write down the feedback that they receive, because maybe June, who was presenting with Jack, he is always having his tab up at his face. You know, he's very, very shy presenting like this. And if he gets that same feedback week after week, he needs to be aware of that. So I encourage my students just to take notes about the feedback they receive, and that way they're also able to keep track of how they're improving week by week. So that's just another tip for you guys. This speaking activity all in should take about 15 minutes in the classroom. And that leads us to the final section of the novel workshop, which this final component is called the literary exercise. So here we have 3 different literary expressions, and these expressions are also going to be mirrored again from the reading and have a similar structure to what we practiced through the writing and the speaking. And now the students will have to write their own sentences again. So the first thing you'll want to do is, in these model sentences, read them out loud as a class, and then have the students underline and identify what parts they'll need to change. So for example, enjoyed nothing more and enjoyed nothing more is the same here. So Roger is what we'll need to change for our first blank. And then same thing, make a note of what they'll be swapping out when they create their own sentences. And this will just help your students to also visually understand exactly what they need to achieve when they're making their own sentences. You also have a function down here with an example. So you can obviously feel free to prepare your own examples. I often make my own media cards with my examples that I know are going to work well with the classroom and the group of students that I have. Or I like to take that as a moment to personalize and use Avengers characters or fun, interesting topics I know my students will be keen on. But embedded in your tab, there is an example anyhow of different sentences that the students could be making if they're stumped. You can take a look at that. And they simply need to create their own sentences by filling in the blanks. Again, you should cold call on a few students to share their sentences with the class and discuss why it's logical, maybe why it is incomplete, or why some of their blanks don't work. And the students can then make some adjustments to their sentences before moving on. This literary exercise is the final part of the novel workshop. It is recommended you take about 10 minutes here, but this could be kind of where you start to run out of a little bit of time, especially because right before we had the speaking presentations. And I like to be a little more thorough with my speaking presentations and maybe reduce this literary exercise down to just about 5 minutes rather than 10. So you can kind of work within the syllabus time recommendations as well to whatever suits your class the best. So that is the last component of the novel workshop, which brings us to the final section, the test prep section. Okay, so this is a really important section of our B2 class because here's where we're learning all of the strategies for test preparation, again, matching with that middle school, high school level. And we're also learning the skills for answering test questions. The students will have exercises and practice sections as well. So first, before we do any activity, we have to teach the students the strategy. Okay, so for any instructors who have taught an A2 class, admissions-based class, a lot of this type of question strategy is going to feel familiar to you because the question types repeat in B2 from like our A2 question types. So for example, in lesson 1 for Tara, the first question type we're going over is main idea or main topic. Okay, so if you've taught A2 before, you can use some of that same prep you've done and now carry it over for your B2 class, which is really awesome. If you haven't taught A2, that's no worries. What you need to do is first explain to the students what this question type is asking for, and they always have a breakdown here that explains for the students. I also like to prep my own media that gives maybe a paraphrased or modified version of this. It can be a little bit complicated or wordy depending on their level, so I like to simplify this explanation and then really focus on the question forms to have the students understand what they'd actually be looking at in a test situation. So the main topic questions, main idea questions, and title questions, you can start to identify with the students in these forms. Why will we call it a main topic? Well, because we can usually see similar words identified in the question. So I just like to show them that pattern. After the question form and explanation, it now walks through the solving strategy, okay? So here it explains to the students the methodology or the steps that they'll need to complete in order to solve a main topic question. So the topic, as it says, is usually repeated, so they should be looking for repeated words. Or if it's in the listening, like we're doing now, they have to listen for expressions that signal the main topic, okay? They go over some expressions for you in the tab, and you can read those together with your class. And then it walks through the different ways and, again, the different steps of what they should be listening for in order to identify the main topic. Okay, so when you go to the next page of the strategy, they give an example question. Okay, so for this sample, if you press your play button here, it will pop up your audio. And what I like to do is, as part of my prep, bookmark the sections of the audio where the repeated words or where the topic signal in a listening come from. So that's part of my prep that I like to do. And the students will have to listen to the audio and then answer the question, what are the speakers mainly talking about? Okay, so in the listening section, I also like to have my students take notes. So in your lesson one, this is just maybe what I like to do, it's my advice. In this lesson one, I also like to start to review or take note of some note-taking tips. Okay, because we are going to be practicing listening, I think the students always should be taking notes. So when they're listening to this example question, I like for them to have their paper notebooks open and be taking notes, listening for repeated words and topic signals. And that way, when we justify the answer, maybe it's really great, you know, all my students answer correctly. Number two, I then can say to my students, okay, let's justify using our notes, right? So did you hear a repeated word? Yes, we heard the word lifting weights repeated. Okay, good. And what was the topic signal? And they can identify for me from their notes. That way we're putting the strategy into place in the classroom. Okay. In your syllabus, it doesn't explicitly go over listening note-taking strategies, and it's not included as part of the SMART textbook in here, but it's just I think a really valuable thing for the students. For me, a rule of thumb is whenever we're listening, we're also taking notes. Okay, so we now have a strategy that looks at purpose questions. Okay, so we were looking at main topic, main idea before, and now they're learning about main purpose because these questions are quite similar. So again, you'll go through the strategy with the students, break down the different expressions and the different steps with your students. There are a whole bunch of different expressions that are included. I don't feel it's necessary to spend time going over all 8. What I like to do is ahead of time when I'm prepping my lesson, if I know that my listening is going to show them an expression of warning, I'll just make sure that I highlight that one as part of the strategy. We'll go over maybe just 1, 2, 3 together. That way I have previewed what's coming next, and I can save some of the other expressions for later lessons. I feel that this can be a little bit overwhelming to the students in the beginning, and they end up getting distracted or losing focus. So just make sure you preview the expression that's going to be relevant to the listening that's coming later in your class. And of course, after they learn the strategy, they'll have to do the example. Okay, and again, you can facilitate this one as a class. Something to make note of as well is this small blue note icon also pops up the script from the listening. So if the students are really struggling, and even if you're replaying sections, maybe the class is missing the mark, it's no problem. You could also pop open this script and then go through the listening that way, and you have a model of everything that was said in the listening section. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Another tip I can give you guys is ahead of time, I'll make teacher model notes. So I'll listen and then make my own notes, and then just take a picture of those and embed it as a media card. That way I can use my own listening notes rather than this full script example. That's just a personal preference, but it's something that you guys could try in your classroom as well. Okay, so the listening test-taking strategies and practice should take around 30 minutes. And after the listening, you move into the, after the listening strategy, you'll move into the actual exercise section. So I actually want to take you guys back here. Right, so we have the strategy, which we've talked about, and now in the exercise, this is where we have a section with 3 different pages of sample questions that the students can now work on individually on their own. Okay, so in your syllabus, it does note that if you don't have time to complete all 3 of the pages, the incomplete pages should be assigned as homework. Okay, so maybe in class we only get through pages 1 and 2, and that means as part of the homework I have to let my students know that they're completing page 3 at home on their own. With the exercise, they have different listening sections that apply the strategy they learn. So again, we have main idea questions, and later in the strategy there's going to be the purpose questions as well, main purpose. Okay, here for the note-taking, it asks the students to fill in the blanks. Again, because we're in low-mid, I think that this is no problem at all for them just to be listening to fill in specific blanks. But what I like to do in later lessons is put eyes on teacher for this section, and then have them simply take notes in the paper notebook, just because I don't want my students getting used to the idea that a table with blanks is going to be provided to them in a test situation, because as we know during achievement test time or other standardized testing that they'll take, they will just simply have paper and a pencil to be taking notes. So in later lessons, maybe starting from lesson 6 or lesson 7, I like to put eyes on the teacher and have the students just take notes without using this blank methodology, I guess I can say. But in your beginning classes, we're here in Terra Lesson 1. It's no problem at all just to have them listen specifically for the blanks. Okay, and then when they have their questions at the bottom, we always want to make sure that our students are justifying, right? So when they're justifying their correct answers, they should be using the notes section to justify why they chose that answer. Okay. So in the practice section, that's the final component, you'll see that it's now in purple. So as I mentioned before, any section that's in purple is a timed battle mode section that requires uploading to the MARP. So here with practice, this is also going to be a timed test scenario where the students will practice the different questions and they actually will receive a score. Now here, it's not based on time, how fast they're able to complete it. It is based on what answers they answer correctly. Okay, so they'll have a score out of 6 and it's converted to a letter grade once again that will appear as part of their C evaluation in the MERP. For the practice, it's not necessary to justify all answers. What I like to do in my class is take a look using the SRS system and see maybe the ratio of what students answered correctly versus incorrectly. If everybody misses question 4, then I know I really want to take a moment to justify this with the students. If everybody or most students get number 2 correct, I like to just cold call a student with the correct answer and have them justify, or kind of pass through it all together because I know that they're able to answer it on their own. So when you're preparing, make sure that you prepare justifications for all 6 questions because you're not going to know what will be missed in the class or what will be received well in the class. So just prep for everything. And then I like to just focus on questions that most of the students or maybe all of the students have missed and justify only those. Okay, so that's the end of the listening test prep section. And that will bring us to the reading test prep section. Okay, so for the reading, this component is actually awarded more time, so the reading should take up to 50 minutes. And that's because there's just more, in-depth work the students need to do in terms of reading the full passages, right? But before they read, you're going to see again the strategy page. Now, the thing that's really great about the way that these B2 classes are set up is that whatever question types and strategies you've worked on in the listening section for the first 30 minutes, you're now going to do maybe the same or a very similar type of question for the reading section. So we can see that in listening, we're doing main idea and purpose, and here now in reading, main idea once again. So a lot of the steps in the strategy you can conduct even as a bit of a review, right? So for a main topic question, how will we know it's a topic question? Because we see the word topic, right? Similarly with main idea, you can now be trying to cold call your students and see if they're able to make the connections between what kinds of keywords in the question form they should be looking for in a test scenario. Similarly, with the strategy, we learned in the listening section that for main topic or main idea questions, they should listen for repeated words. So we can ask our students to infer in a reading, what should we be looking for? What kind of words? And hopefully they're going to be able to figure out that they should be looking for repeated words that appear through the passage. Okay, so you're still going to take time to go through the different steps. Here we also have transitions that will signal the main idea. Again, there are a whole bunch of different transitions and different expressions that the tab selects. I like to, again, just put myself in the shoes of a low, mid-level student learning ESL. And when I see this on my tab or on the teacher's tab and screen here, this is just like, a big wall of text for the students. So again, I think in your prep, what you need to do is either take the initiative to make your own media cards that are going to be able to help the students understand these topic signals or expressions a little bit more clearly and simply, or as I mentioned previously, only read out loud and preview the signals that you know are going to be relevant to this week's reading or the practice that's coming next. So maybe this week, a lot of my readings have a lot of contrast transitions. That means I'm only in lesson 1. I can simply just focus on these transitions for today, and I'll have more time in later lessons to build up the rest of the types of transitions with my students as to not overwhelm them. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're prepping. Right, and then as part of our strategy, we're also going to want to do an example. So again, this is totally guided. This is all together as a class with the teacher's help, going through the passage and answering the questions. So here we have main idea questions and our best title question. So you'll want to preview the different questions with your students and then try and apply the strategy. So in the passage, you want to make sure the students are looking for the repeated words. When they look for those repeated words, they could be circling them, they could be underlining. I like to keep it consistent in my class. I make a bit of a legend. So for me, I circle repeated words and I put a box around transitions. Feel free to do whatever you want in your class, but I recommend that you keep it consistent. So whenever I'm asking my students to find transitions, we box them, and when we're looking for repeated words, we circle them. Okay, so they can go through the strategy, and after we complete the strategy as a class, we can then try and, read the questions out loud and answer them all together. Okay. And again, now we have our other question type of the main purpose. It's really great. We've seen that before in the listening, so hopefully now they're familiar with it. And again, you can do more cold calling in order to go through the solving strategy a bit more quickly here and see if they were able to kind of retain what you taught them just previously in the listening question type section. Again, go through your different expressions. And then we want to apply the strategy with the same steps all together as a class and with teacher's guidance. That brings us to the end of the strategy, and it leads right into the exercise. So with the exercise, again, they're going to have different reading passages, and they'll have to here fill in the blanks to match the appropriate words. Now this section for the reading, what it's asking them to do is essentially take this reading passage and summarize it into the table. And then from here, it will make it easier for them to answer the passage question as well. And it will be able to see if they're able to kind of logically make connections between how the passage is organized. Okay? One thing I do with these exercises as well is I incentivize great student behavior and participation through group work in the end of class. My students are super keen to work with a desk friend or work in small groups. So for some of these reading pages, if they've all been behaving really well and participating in my class, trying their best, that means that for some of the pages that are here out of the 3, I might take page number 2 and let that be some group work. That way the students are having a lot of fun and they're still staying on task and doing their work. Again, these exercise pages, if there's anything that's not completed in the classroom, it needs to be assigned as homework. So often that ends up being your 3rd page, just for time's sake. Right, so just keep that in mind. Okay, and then one thing I want to point you guys to is in the syllabus, it goes over all the different question types that the students might run into, as well as the different text types. So I think that with question types as instructors, this is pretty straightforward. We can figure out the students are working on main idea questions, detail questions, or inferences. But this is something that I think for myself, I maybe overlooked in the beginning, but it's really quite important, and it's the text type. So you also want to be identifying with your students, whether it be the listening section or the reading section in test prep, what kind of text or listening are we working on? Are we doing a map in the reading? Are we reading a notice? Are we reading an advertisement or a phone message? And depending on the type, what can we then know about how to find the main ideas or the details or the inferences? Those kinds of things. Same thing over here, you have speeches, discussions, conversations, or lectures that happen in the listening. And it's good to go over with your students, for example, the difference between listening to a conversation or listening to a lecture. What does that mean about our note-taking? What does that mean about how we're going to answer the questions? So this is something you'll want to work on in your class, as well as identifying the type of text or audio that the students are listening to. Okay. So for example, if we want to put that into practice, here, this text type is an announcement at a school. Junk food will no longer be sold on campus. Okay, so we want to go through that with the students. I like to prepare media as well of pictures that show, maybe more clearly an announcement they might see actually in their school. Here, it's a lot of like university campus type announcements, but maybe I'll get a picture of an announcement they'd see in their elementary school about a picnic that's coming up, that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind as you're prepping and going through the text types with your students. Right, and then of course, after we strategize, after we do the exercises and finish all of that, the students have to practice. And with the practice, again for the reading, it is a timed component and it is a test component. So they will read and answer the different questions down here. If you pop open your board at the bottom, you'll see that there are 6 reading questions, just like we had 6 listening questions. And based off of the completion, they'll get a score out of 6 for what they answered correctly. And again, just as I do in listening, I recommend that you review the weakest question responses. Okay, so there's actually a function where you can do that. In your actual classroom too, when you go to upload the scores, you'll be able to see a function that says weakest question type, and you could specifically review those questions rather than all of them. Time permitting too, right? Because now that we're in the reading section of test prep, we're nearing the end of the class, and this is where I usually end up running out of time. So just make sure though, if the students miss a question altogether, maybe number 5, the purpose of this announcement was really tricky, I do want to take a moment to at least explain or have students justify and work together to figure out what the correct answer is. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the class. There's 5 minutes at the end just to wrap up. Make sure that you're always assigning the incomplete exercises as homework. In the wrap up, you can also maybe preview or start to talk about what's coming next in the lesson 2. So that is everything for our B2 class. I wish everybody best of luck in their classes and happy learning.